Welcome to our In Focus coverage tonight on the shrinking Great Salt Lake. For much of its history, the lake covered an area nearly the size of the state of Delaware. However, for years, the largest natural lake west of the Mississippi has been shrinking. Chris Havlick of the Associated Press has the story.
It's a disheartening afternoon for sailors at the only remaining marina on Utah's Great Salt Lake.
It's crane day. We're pulling boats out of the lake because there's no water to sail.
We didn't have a very good winter at all, and so now we're forced to pull our boats from the marina before they get trapped in here.
With higher temperatures, less precipitation, and feeder streams being diverted to people, water levels have been slipping for years. It's a bellwether of an overall drought gripping the western United States this summer that is expected to eventually drop lake levels to the lowest in 170 years.
We're approaching one of the historic lows in the surface elevation of Great Salt Lake, and that means that everything changes.
Changes that have repercussions far beyond the lake's shores. Migrating birds, like pelicans, are losing habitat, and even the billion-dollar ski industry could take a hit. One of the key impacts isn't in the water, but in the air. Researchers say the area's strong winds can kick up the exposed lakebed's dust, which contains dangerous naturally occurring arsenic that people could potentially breathe in.
As the lake continues to decrease, it has exposed more than 750 square miles of lakebed.
As it's picked up by winds, the dust lands on surrounding mountains, causing snow to melt more rapidly. Faster melt affects the snowpack that provides for premier skiing, along with diminishing the region's fresh water supplies.
If we don't allow the lake to have its own water rights so that we can preserve the amount of water that's flowing into the lake, the future of the lake is quite bleak.
Back at the marina, sailors lament the loss of a treasured pastime.
Yeah, it's just sad. This is something that you get out on this lake and it's better than going to a psychiatrist, I say. Some people don't think that we're ever going to be able to get back in.
A stark reminder that the drought has only just begun. Chris Havlick, Associated Press.
Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight. As you all know, we are experiencing another year of drought due to the mild winter and heat. Water levels are low across the state, including the Great Salt Lake, which is nearing levels we have not seen for 170 years. Tonight, we want to talk about the lake and what the impacts will be if it continues to shrink. Kicking off our conversation tonight live via Zoom is Lindsay Whitehurst, a reporter for the Associated Press. She just published a story about the Great Salt Lake on Tuesday. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Let's start with why you decided to report on the levels of the Great Salt Lake. Was there a tipping point?
You know, this really started as a drought story that, of course, Utah's been in the grips of this mega drought across the whole American West. And we really wanted to look at the places where you could most see the effects of that drought. And of course, what we learned in our reporting is it is about the drought, but this is about more than that on the Great Salt Lake. But that's where we started from, and we just kept learning from there.
So fascinating. What jumped out of the story for our producer was that it is now a 10-minute walk from picnic tables on Antelope Island to the shore of the Great Salt Lake. What struck you the most about what you found out in your reporting?
Right. You see, historically, you see a lot of people going to resorts along the Great Salt Lake, that it's really a great place to recreate. And that's just not something you see quite as much anymore on the same level, right? People still go. It's still an absolutely beautiful place. But a lot of the spots where you go, you can tell that these facilities like these picnic tables were built to be quite close to the lake. And then, but when you actually get out to it now, it takes you quite a while to get out there. And of course, there are some places where people don't go there as much anymore. And it's really changed. I talked to one man who actually was a 90-plus-year-old man who took a ride on a paraglider, of a motorized paraglider over the Great Salt Lake. And he just remembered from his childhood how much it had changed when he could see from the air how much lower it was from his own childhood.
Right, and this was an area that was thriving at one point, and now it sort of has a sad and eerie feeling about it. Now, we'll talk about some of the impacts the receding lake is having in the next segment, but can you talk to us about the effect that this shrinking size is having on migratory birds?
Right. So the pelicans, there's a nesting site in the Great Salt Lake, what has historically been a very remote island where they're able to lay their eggs, raise their young, more or less completely isolated from the rest of the world, from any predators. And this has been a fairly large portion of the whole population of this bird. Something like 20% of the whole population of the American white pelican has nested on this island, Gunnison Island in the Great Salt Lake. And now, because of these declining lake levels, there's actually been a land bridge that has opened up. So now predators can get to this remote island, coyotes and foxes. And what they do is that the pelicans are adapted to being very sheltered. And they're these massive, magnificent birds, but they're quite shy. And their protection is to fly away when they see these predators come up. So then other predators can come along and actually eat the eggs, eat the young, seagulls mostly. And so what we've seen is that these birds have been already affected by this. And the Great Salt Lake, of course, is a huge stopping point for a lot of migratory birds in the U.S. We think of it, I think we tend to think of it a little bit as something where there's not a lot of life because there aren't a lot of fish or any fish that can survive in the Great Salt Lake. It's all brine shrimp, and so I think there can be a perception that it's almost like a Dead Sea kind of thing. But when it comes to avian life, to birds, it's anything but. It's a really important stopover on those paths.
It really just shows that this drought has a ripple effect, especially on our wildlife. Now, the Great Salt Lake has always been a shallow lake, but what is happening to the people who boat and recreate on the lake?
Right, it's about 35 feet deep at its steepest point, so really not a terribly deep lake, especially given how big it is. It's bigger than the state of Delaware. This is another thing I learned in this reporting. It's just a massive body of water, so it's a little hard to imagine it being as effective as it is. The lake levels and the exposed lake bed are really quite sensitive to not getting as much water into the lake, and so it really becomes something that's a little bit hard to wrap your head around. And I want to make sure I answered your whole question. Take me back again to exactly where we started too. I don't want to get too lost talking about these interesting things.
Oh, no worries. I was just wondering what's happening to people who boat and recreate on the lake.
Right. Thank you so much. A lot of people love this lake, especially people on sailboats. The greater salinity of the water really makes it a terrific place to sailboat, and especially because you don't have a lot of motorized boat traffic, it's a really peaceful place for a lot of people. And we went to where they had to hoist the boats out of the water because the lake levels are going to get so low. These boats would be stuck if they don't take them out of the water now. And it was a really interesting thing to see, and you could really tell the community that people had around sailing in this lake. But it was also just a very sad day because it should have been kind of the beginning of the season. There should have been a lot of sailing left, and so it was really a sad thing to have to talk about, to think about when are we going to be able to be out on these waters that we love again. And it's kind of a question mark. People don't know for sure when they're going to be able to put their boats back in, some of them.
Right. Lindsay, what worries you the most with what you've learned through working on this story?
You know, I think that the greater exposed lake bed, I think, is an issue that we're really starting to learn more about. And so in California, they've had an issue with other lakes that have been, Owens Lake in particular, that was essentially pumped dry for drinking water in LA. There was a real dust problem there, and we're lucky here that the exposed lake bed of the Great Salt Lake isn't easy to kick up by wind. It has a crust over it that helps protect that dust underneath. But if that changes with more lake bed being exposed, that could mean even more dust in the air, which of course is a big problem in the wintertime with wintertime inversion. We already have that as an issue. So the idea that even more dust could possibly get kicked up off the lake bed, that's a concern because we have a very large urban area not far at all all from this Salt Lake, the Salt Lake City and its suburbs that are named for it. So that was one thing that I think could become a bigger issue and could even affect the ski industry if more dust gets picked up on this dry lake bed, eventually settles in the mountains on our famous snow. There could even be an effect there. And there's still a lot of research going on. We don't know everything around those yet, but I think those are emerging issues that concern me as somebody who lives in the area. Right,
as if our air wasn't bad enough. Unfortunately, we are out of time, Lindsay, but thank you so much for joining us. Folks, you've been hearing from Lindsay Whitehurst, reporter for the Associated Press. Lindsay, thank you so much for being here tonight to discuss the findings in your report.
Thanks so much for having me.
We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us for our In Focus discussion tonight on the low levels of the Great Salt Lake. We turn now to the economic and environmental impacts of the current state of the lake. Joining us next live in studio are Representative Tim Hawks of Centerville, who also represents the brine shrimp industry, and Dr. Kevin Perry, Associate Professor of Atmospheric Science at the University of Utah. Gentlemen, thank you so much to you both for being here tonight. We have a lot to get to. We will start with you first, Representative Hawks. Can you talk about the Great Salt Lake industries in Utah and how the declining levels are affecting them?
Sure. Thanks, Rosie. When we talk about industries that directly affect the Great Salt Lake, we're talking about maybe 7,000 jobs and between $1.3 and $1.6 billion in economic activity. Most of that comes in the form of the mineral extraction industries. If you think about the Great Salt Lake, water falls in the form of snow or rain in the mountains. It picks up minerals, brings them down into the lake, and there are a lot of important industries that extract minerals from that. If you've ever picked up a soda can or a beer can, that contains magnesium from the Great Salt Lake. If you like to eat fruit, you buy fruit at the store, or almonds, chances are those crops were fertilized with sulfate of potash, a really important fertilizer that comes from the Great Salt Lake. And there are really other important minerals that are extracted out there, increasing ones like lithium that goes into rechargeable batteries. So that's a big and important industry. The brine shrimp industry, of which I'm a part, is also important. Brine shrimp is used to feed baby shrimp and fish around the world and really goes to feed the needs of a growing world. So I think in terms of effects on those industries, most immediate is when the lake levels go down, it raises the cost of doing business. In our case, it means that we have to pay $1 million that we didn't plan on paying just to dredge so that we can get our boats down to the water and in and out of harbors and out onto the lake. And so it increased those costs up front. Over the long term, what happens is as you have less water, those minerals get more and more concentrated, those salts get more and more concentrated, and then that really starts to put stress on the ecosystem, on the brine shrimp and on the birds that rely on them for their survival.
That is so fascinating. Thank you for putting that into perspective for us. Let's turn to you now, Dr. Perry. Can you talk about the effect a smaller lake will have on our snowpack?
Sure. The lake, because it's salty, doesn't freeze during the winter, and as we have storms that move across that lake, it picks up water and heat from the lake itself, which helps to accentuate the storms and leads to what we call lake effect snow. And that lake effect snow adds to our snowpack every year. Researchers at the University of Utah, in particular, a study done by Professor Jim Steenberg, have shown that this lake effect snow adds an additional 5 to 8% of snow to our Wasatch Mountains. But more importantly, they've discovered that much of that lake effect snow, although it can occur in any month during the winter, can contribute significantly to our early season snowpack, which has implications for the ski industry. Other researchers at the University of Utah, Dr. Mackenzie Skiles, have identified dust on the snow, basically coming from playas and from exposed lakebed, that has an impact on the snow late in the season. It changes it basically darkens the snowpack, and anything that gets dark on the snow will increase the amount of energy that's absorbed by the sun, which will accelerate the melt rate. And so the shrinking lake has impacts on basically reducing the ski season by reducing the amount of snow at the beginning and the end of the season.
It's so fascinating the way that the drought and the shrinking levels of the lake impacts all these industries that we may not think about. Representative Hawks, speaking as a lawmaker, what, if anything, can be done about this issue?
Well, thanks for asking that question. The lake it's a big lake, and it's reflective of everything that's going on in the watershed. And so a lot of the solutions are really complicated and difficult, and all of them are expensive if we think about trying to reverse it. However, I think the good news is that there are concrete things that each of us can do. The most significant is to simply stop using as much water on our lawns as we do now. We don't use a lot of that lawn, and we overwater in many cases. And so just little things that normal people can do, particularly reducing their outdoor watering, that ultimately benefits our entire water supply and the lake itself. So there are concrete things that people can do. Longer term, as a legislature, you know, we're going to have to get serious about it. And it's going to take everybody working together to solve this enormously challenging problem.
Right, it really is a whole state effort. Dr. Perry, we have about 30 seconds left. In your mind, how dire is this problem, and how should we think about the lake when we think about the runoff?
Well, if we think about the lake, we don't have to look far to see examples of what happens when you divert too much water from an ecosystem. We have Owens Lake in California, which turned out to be one of the largest dust sources in North America. And the Great Salt Lake has the potential to be a very significant dust source as well. So we need to get past the narrative that water that makes it into the Great Salt Lake is being wasted, because the lake has needs, and without that water, the lake will continue to be a dust source, which will impact the air quality locally.
Well said. I wish we had more time with the both of you. You've been hearing from Representative Tim Hawks and Dr. Kevin Perry. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. We enjoyed having the both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Welcome to our third and final segment of our In Focus discussion on the receding Great Salt Lake. Rounding out our conversation tonight live in studio is Laura Vernon. She is the Great Salt Lake Coordinator for the Utah Department of Natural Resources. And Laura, thank you so much for being here tonight. We are giving you some of the harder questions. Can you talk about the need for water in Utah and how that affects the level of the Great Salt Lake?
Sure. Thank you, Rosie. I think this summer we all need water in Utah, and the Great Salt Lake needs water as well. As we look to Utah as one of the fastest growing and driest states in the nation, we need to recognize that how we grow responsibly will impact not only the land surrounding the Great Salt Lake, but the Great Salt Lake levels as well. So growing and developing responsibly will help ensure we get water to the Great Salt Lake.
And what about the role of the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council as it relates to the low lake levels of the Great Salt Lake?
Sure. Over the last 10 years, the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council has been supporting research that helps us understand the importance of the Great Salt Lake in general and why it's important to keep water in the Great Salt Lake. For the last 10 years, the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council has been helping inform the debate about the Great Salt Lake and why we need to get water to it.
What are some of the key takeaways from the council's work that will help everyone understand the impacts to the lake?
Sure. I think one of the most important studies that was done by the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council was the economic study done in 2012 that disclosed that the Great Salt Lake brings in $1.3 billion annually to the state of Utah and generates over 7,000 jobs. In an additional study, we also looked at what are the implications of a drying Great Salt Lake. What is it going to cost the state if the lake dries up? And so with that, we found that each year, depending on how low the lake goes, the state could be impacted over $2 billion annually. And that could come in the form of decreased industry like mineral and brine shrimp operations like Representative Hawks said, but it could also come in the form of reduced skier days, also decreased property values as air quality is impacted, as well as increased medical costs because of poor air quality.
Laura, do you think that we might be close to the point of no return for the lake? How worried are you?
No, I don't think we're close to a point of no return. The lake has fluctuated historically. In 1963 was the historic low, and 20 years later it rose to its historic high. And so the lake does fluctuate, and I'm hopeful that we can get back to a point where the lake is sustainable and we can sustain all of the resources that the lake brings to us.
Okay, that's good news. Now, I asked our last two guests this question. I want to ask you this question too. What can people do about it as they're thinking about this topic?
Well, Representative Hawks was right. We can just all use less water. We can talk to our legislature and let them know that we think that the Great Salt Lake is important. Keeping water in the lake is important. We can, when we're considering conversion of land use, we can look at integrating water planning into land use planning so we get an understanding of how much water is being used upstream from the lake, so we know how much water is going to be getting to the lake.
Now, Laura, Salt Lake City is named in conjunction with the Great Salt Lake. So on a map, we all know where we are by looking for the lake. What does the lake mean to our identity as Utahns, and what do you think about now that the lake is in such a dire state?
Well, I think that the Great Salt Lake has shaped the identity of Utah since, since we've established this valley over 150 years ago. The lake has been a focal point of the city of the Salt Lake Valley, and it all connects us. It's something that we can all identify with. Like you said, we look at a map, we know exactly where we are. We know that we can identify this as our home state. We also know when we're flying over the Great Salt Lake and we see the pinkish waters of the North Arm or Antelope Island, we know that we're home, and we know that that the Great Salt Lake connects us culturally to this place, and it creates this sense of place for our Salt Lake City residents. And I'm hoping that we can continue that connection for generations to come.
Well said, and I think that's why the news of the Great Salt Lake shrinking, and it has that heavier feel to us all, because as you said, as our guests have said, this is part of our identity as Utahns. All right, you've been hearing from Laura Vernon, the Great Salt Lake Coordinator from the Utah Department of Natural Resources. Laura, thank you so much for being here tonight. We enjoyed having you.
Thank you so much.
And don't forget, we'd love to hear from you about the show. We invite you to join our Facebook group by going to facebook.com/groups/ABC4infocus, or you can send us an email, infocus@abc4.com.